He thought he could humiliate her, but he had no idea he'd just walked into his own destruction. The boardroom at Hamilton and Pierce LLP gleamed with polished mahogany, sunlight bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows and reflecting in the glasses of the partners seated at the long table. Emma Carter slipped quietly into the room, her gray cardigan simple, her hair tied back in a neat bun, her hands carrying a leather-bound folder with meticulous care. At 32, she had learned to move like a shadow in spaces where attention was rarely welcome. The chatter among the partners, Mr. Johnson's sharp voice cutting across the room, Ms. Blake adjusting her designer blazer, a few pens clicking and the hum of air conditioning filled the background, none of them registering her presence beyond the polite nod she offered. Today, however, was different. The partners had decided to demonstrate authority by calling Emma forward to review a client proposal in front of the entire board, under the pretense of testing her competence. As she approached the table, Mr. Johnson's eyes flicked over her cardigan and unassuming shoes, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Emma, do you really think you're ready to handle this?" he asked with deliberate condescension, his tone sharp enough to slice through the polite murmur of the room. Emma's fingers tightened around the folder. She looked down for a moment, letting the silence linger, a measured pause that drew the eyes of the other partners and a few junior associates who were peeking from the doorway. Ms. Blake leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed, voice dripping with skepticism. "Let's see if our quiet little Emma can even make sense of these numbers before we waste our time," she added, a soft laugh punctuating her words. Emma's lips curved into a small, controlled smile, almost imperceptible, as she stepped closer to the table, placing the folder gently in front of her, her eyes steady despite the oppressive gaze of the room. She took a slow, deliberate breath, absorbing every detail, the way the sunlight highlighted the edge of the documents, the slight tilt of Mr. Johnson's pen as he prepared to interrupt, the subtle smirk still lingering on Ms. Blake's face. None of them knew that behind the quiet demeanor, Emma had spent years mastering financial modeling and contract analysis, often under pressure far greater than this polished, intimidating boardroom could provide. She opened the folder just enough to reveal crisp, neatly organized pages, her notes meticulously detailed, the calculations precise, the annotations clear and professional. As she glanced up, her eyes met Mr. Johnson's, and for a fleeting moment, the smirk faltered, replaced by a subtle flicker of uncertainty he quickly tried to mask. Emma began to speak softly, deliberately, drawing attention not to herself but to the data, to the logic, guiding the discussion with calm precision, referencing clauses and figures in ways that suggested complete command of the material. Each word she chose carried weight, subtle authority, and an unshakable confidence, the kind that made the boardroom settle into a tense, anticipatory silence. Even the junior associates stopped shuffling papers, sensing the shift in the air, the undercurrent of a moment about to turn unexpectedly. The partners, used to wielding control, had failed to anticipate the quiet brilliance sitting among them, the mind behind the soft voice poised to dismantle any assumptions before a single glance could be misinterpreted. The room, filled with glossy surfaces and the faint scent of polished wood and coffee, held its breath as Emma's first few statements cut through the pretense of superiority, laying the groundwork for a revelation that none of them had seen coming, every calculated pause, every measured explanation building toward a crescendo that would redefine respect in that space. Emma Carter moved to the side of the long polished table, her gray cardigan blending softly against the neutral tones of the boardroom walls. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the edge of her folder, making the crisp pages glint as if signaling the beginning of something unexpected. She watched Mr. Johnson and Ms. Blake exchange quick, confident glances, their hands resting on leather-bound agendas, pens poised for interruption, ready to assert authority over the discussion. The hum of the air conditioning and the quiet tapping of fingers against wood created a rhythm of anticipation, one that Emma had long learned to match with her own measured presence. She placed the folder on the table just far enough to allow access, yet close enough to assert her quiet claim to the space, her blue eyes steady, betraying nothing of the meticulous calculations and careful cross-references she had reviewed on her morning commute. As Mr. Johnson leaned forward, his brow slightly furrowed, he opened the conversation with a thinly veiled challenge, questioning the feasibility of the projections and the structure of the client's strategy, his tone polished but unmistakably condescending. Emma responded with soft, deliberate speech, her voice smooth and confident, pointing out inconsistencies and potential opportunities, referencing clauses with precise terminology that drew subtle nods from a few junior associates lingering at the edges of the room. Each sentence built upon the last, forming a pattern of logical reasoning and calm authority that contrasted sharply with the overt display of power from the partners. Ms. Blake shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture to convey control, yet a flicker of surprise passed across her features as Emma highlighted a key oversight in the proposal that had eluded even the most seasoned attorneys. The boardroom, once a place of expected hierarchy and intimidation, began to feel smaller as Emma's words carried weight, each point measured, each explanation layered with evidence and insight. She glanced briefly at the digital screen projecting financial charts, making subtle annotations that tied each number to strategic implications, all the while maintaining eye contact with the senior partners in a way that was neither confrontational nor timid, merely authoritative. The quiet tapping of pens ceased as attention shifted fully to her, the faint scent of polished wood and coffee mixing with the intangible tension that had settled like a veil over the room. For the first time that morning, the partners realized that the calm, unassuming woman at the side of the table had prepared for this moment in a way that outstripped their expectations, her quiet diligence and analytical skill revealing a command of detail that left little room for doubt. Emma's hands moved with careful precision as she referenced notes and highlighted figures, creating a rhythm that mirrored the logic of her argument, her tone soft but compelling, the kind that made listening a necessity rather than a choice. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted imperceptibly, the prior confidence of the partners giving way to a subtle unease as they absorbed her points and recognized the depth of understanding that had been hidden behind her modest demeanor. The room, filled moments ago with polite murmurs and controlled authority, now held its collective breath, hanging on each word, each measured explanation, as Emma Carter quietly and methodically demonstrated competence, intellect, and clarity that commanded attention without demanding it, the quiet power in her presence steadily redefining the balance of respect in the space. Emma Carter paused for a moment, letting the partners adjust to the rhythm of her presentation, the soft hum of the air conditioning blending with the subtle scratch of pens across notepads. The sunlight continued to pour through the wide windows, casting angular lines across the polished mahogany table, highlighting the tension that had settled over the room. Mr. Johnson leaned back slightly, trying to maintain the veneer of authority, yet a flicker of doubt crossed his face as Emma traced a sequence of calculations with her pen, each point layered with evidence and insight. Ms. Blake shifted in her seat, adjusting her posture, her gaze following Emma's movements with a growing awareness that the quiet woman they had underestimated possessed an almost encyclopedic command of the subject matter. Emma's voice remained calm and deliberate, soft enough to draw attention but firm enough to establish control, weaving through the complex web of figures and clauses with precision that invited rather than demanded focus. She highlighted discrepancies, proposed alternative strategies, and subtly referenced precedent cases, each explanation carefully chosen to guide the conversation without confronting directly, creating a cadence that resonated through the room. The junior associates, who had been hovering at the periphery, leaned in slightly, sensing the shift in the balance of authority, while the partners' confident glances began to waver under the weight of her meticulous reasoning. Emma's hands moved smoothly across the folder and the table, turning pages and pointing to figures with controlled gestures, the quiet confidence in her posture complementing the measured tone of her speech. Every statement built upon the last, forming a network of logic that highlighted both the strengths and weaknesses of the proposals before them, drawing silent acknowledgement from those who had not expected such depth of understanding. The room, once a stage for overt displays of power and subtle intimidation, now vibrated with the quiet authority of competence. The partners' previous smirks replaced with thoughtful frowns as they absorbed each point, realizing the magnitude of the oversight in underestimating Emma Carter. Her eyes remained steady, flicking occasionally to the data on the screen, linking each numerical point to actionable insight, translating complex financial structures into understandable terms without sacrificing nuance. The polished floor reflected the light, and with each careful word, each deliberate motion, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation, as the quiet woman at the center of the room began to reshape the perception of control, demonstrating that calm, methodical expertise could hold as much influence as overt status and authority. Emma's composure remained unwavering, the subtle power in her presentation commanding attention, drawing the boardroom into a rhythm dictated not by intimidation or hierarchy but by clarity, preparation, and the quiet force of well-applied knowledge, leaving Mr. Johnson and Ms. Blake to silently reassess the weight of their assumptions and the room itself to absorb the shift in dynamic as the discussion continued. Emma Carter paused briefly, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany table as she scanned the faces around her, noting the subtle shifts in posture and expression. The sunlight had moved slightly, casting long, angular shadows across the room, accentuating the sharp lines of the partners' suits and the polished sheen of the table. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat, a thin, controlled sound meant to reassert dominance, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty as he realized the depth of Emma's preparedness. Ms. Blake tapped her pen against the table with a rhythm that was meant to intimidate, yet it only served to draw attention to her growing discomfort as Emma calmly outlined the next segment of the client proposal, her voice steady and deliberate. She referenced financial projections, legal precedents, and potential strategic outcomes, each point linked with impeccable clarity to supporting documents, her gestures precise and controlled, demonstrating mastery without overtly demanding attention. The room was quiet, save for the occasional soft shuffle of papers or the subtle inhalation of a breath, as each board member realized they were witnessing a demonstration of competence that far exceeded any expectation they had formed from her quiet demeanor. Emma's eyes moved methodically across the table, connecting with each partner in turn, gauging their understanding, adjusting her pace to ensure clarity while maintaining an unspoken command of authority. Junior associates at the edges of the room leaned forward slightly, captivated by the clarity and confidence in her presentation, noticing how every word was chosen to educate and guide, leaving no room for doubt or distraction. Mr. Johnson shifted in his seat, the practiced lines of authority around his mouth softening imperceptibly as he absorbed the precision of her reasoning, the logical connections she made exposing gaps in their initial assumptions. Ms. Blake's expression, though composed, flickered with recognition that the quiet woman before them was operating on a level of understanding they had not anticipated, each annotation and explanation building an invisible framework that subtly realigned the dynamics of the room. The polished floor reflected the light, and as Emma pointed to specific clauses and numerical summaries, her gestures were both instructional and commanding, reinforcing the rhythm of her argument while keeping the attention firmly centered on the material rather than the drama of authority. The air seemed to thicken with concentration, the subtle scent of coffee and polished wood now accompanied by the intangible weight of intellect asserting itself in a space previously dominated by overt displays of status. Emma's tone remained measured, neither forceful nor apologetic, simply confident and clear, allowing the structure of her knowledge and the coherence of her points to establish a silent authority that required acknowledgement. Every motion, every carefully selected phrase, every pause and emphasis contributed to a crescendo of understanding, drawing the boardroom into a quiet anticipation, as if the room itself were holding its breath, awaiting the moment when the full scope of Emma Carter's insight would leave the partners with no choice but to recognize the depth of expertise hidden behind her modest presence. Emma Carter straightened her shoulders and allowed her calm confidence to fill the room as she began to present the final section of the proposal, her voice steady and clear, carrying every word across the polished mahogany table with quiet authority. The partners, Mr. Johnson and Ms. Blake, leaned in instinctively, the subtle tension in their posture betraying a flicker of surprise as Emma guided them through a complex series of scenarios, linking legal strategy with financial projections in a way that was precise, concise, and impossible to dismiss. Each point she made was reinforced by well-organized charts and annotations, her hands moving methodically over the documents, drawing attention to critical details without a hint of overstatement or arrogance. The room, which had started as a stage for condescension and assumed superiority, now hummed with an attentive silence, the hum of the air conditioning and soft ticking of a wall clock forming the only background to the meticulous articulation of her analysis. Emma referenced precedents and highlighted potential risks with an ease that revealed her thorough preparation, the depth of knowledge and analytical skill evident in each carefully chosen phrase. She allowed a brief pause after each major point, letting the weight of her reasoning sink in. As the partners adjusted their expressions, the initial smugness replaced by contemplation, their earlier gestures of authority giving way to subtle nods of acknowledgement. Junior associates and other staff present shifted in their seats, noticing how Emma's measured demeanor and precise explanations commanded attention and respect without requiring volume or dominance. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast gentle reflections across the table, illuminating the subtle changes in the partners' faces, the tightening of a jaw, the brief lifting of eyebrows, the slight leaning forward to absorb every detail, all without interrupting the rhythm of her delivery. Emma connected each argument seamlessly to the supporting documents, her hands pointing to specific figures, clauses, and projections with the kind of deliberate care that made the logic behind each recommendation undeniable. The room remained quiet, the silence heavy with anticipation as Emma moved through the final points, her cadence measured, deliberate, and calm, drawing the boardroom into a shared understanding, a collective recognition of her skill and insight. Mr. Johnson's hand hovered over his pen, momentarily frozen, as he reconsidered the assumptions he had made at the start of the meeting, while Ms. Blake shifted subtly, her carefully maintained composure flickering ever so slightly under the clarity and thoroughness of Emma's analysis. The air, scented faintly with polished wood and coffee, seemed to thicken with focus, the space transformed from one of assumed hierarchy into a setting defined by the quiet authority of competence and preparation. Emma's eyes scanned the room, acknowledging subtle reactions without breaking the flow of her presentation, her soft voice and deliberate gestures orchestrating the attention of all present, guiding them through complex material with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, establishing a presence that was as commanding as it was unassuming, ensuring that by the time she concluded, the partners and board members alike could not deny the depth, intelligence, and preparedness of the quiet woman who had just demonstrated a mastery far beyond their expectations. Emma Carter took a measured breath and allowed the final segment of her analysis to resonate fully across the boardroom, her eyes briefly scanning each partner, noting the subtle shifts in their posture and expression as the weight of her reasoning became undeniable. The sunlight streaming through the wide windows created a warm glow across the polished surfaces, catching the edges of the documents and highlighting the crisp, precise annotations that accompanied her verbal points. Mr. Johnson's hands rested momentarily on the table, a slight tightening of his jaw revealing a recognition of the depth of Emma's understanding, while Ms. Blake's pen paused mid-motion, her earlier confidence tempered by the clarity and thoroughness of each argument presented. Emma's voice remained soft but firm, her cadence deliberate, drawing the attention of every individual in the room, guiding them through complex financial and legal scenarios with an effortless flow that left no ambiguity and demanded acknowledgement through the undeniable logic of her presentation. The junior associates and staff present leaned forward, the quiet intensity of the room capturing their attention, each recognizing that they were witnessing a moment where preparation, intelligence, and composure had shifted the balance of authority entirely. As Emma connected each insight with supporting documentation, linking projections and legal implications in seamless continuity, the boardroom absorbed the precision and clarity, the previous murmurs of authority replaced with a reflective silence, the kind that accompanies the sudden understanding of underestimated talent. Mr. Johnson exchanged a quick glance with Ms. Blake, both acknowledging silently the competence and quiet authority of the woman they had initially dismissed, their expressions a mix of surprise, respect, and the subtle discomfort of having misjudged her entirely. Emma's hands moved deliberately, pointing to critical figures, highlighting key clauses, and directing focus with a composed elegance that reinforced the impact of her words, her steady presence commanding attention without force or ostentation. The polished floor reflected the sunlight and the faint hum of the air conditioning, yet the dominant presence in the room was now defined not by titles or status, but by the calm, methodical authority emanating from Emma Carter. Each statement she made seemed to reinforce the growing realization among the partners that the quiet woman who had entered the room had quietly taken control of the conversation, framing complex points in ways that were accessible yet undeniable in their accuracy and insight. The boardroom, filled moments ago with confident gestures and subtle attempts at dominance, now held a quiet reverence for the clarity and depth Emma had provided. The previous assumption of hierarchy replaced by a recognition that respect in this space was earned through preparation, intelligence, and the measured delivery of insight. The partners' initial smirks and poised pens were now replaced with attentive listening, thoughtful consideration, and a subtle acknowledgement that the presence of Emma Carter had not only shifted the discussion but also redefined the understanding of capability and authority within that room, leaving the space charged with a quiet yet unmistakable energy of recognition and respect. Emma Carter leaned slightly forward, her voice steady and deliberate as she transitioned into the final demonstration of her strategic insight, laying out a sequence of recommendations that tied together every point previously discussed. The boardroom, which had been filled with quiet tension and anticipation, now seemed suspended in a kind of reverent stillness, each partner following her words with the attention of someone recognizing expertise they had not expected to encounter. Mr. Johnson adjusted his glasses and glanced at Ms. Blake, their confident postures slightly softened as Emma guided them through a layered analysis of client risks, potential contingencies, and compliance considerations, her explanations bridging complex legal terminology and practical outcomes with a clarity that made the reasoning undeniable. Her hands moved deliberately over the table, pointing to charts, clauses, and figures without haste, each gesture reinforcing the weight of her words while maintaining a graceful composure. The sunlight continued to illuminate the room, glinting off polished surfaces and highlighting the subtle changes in expressions among the partners, from furrowed brows to slow nods, each revealing a dawning realization of Emma's command over the material. Junior associates, who had initially been hesitant to speak or interject, now leaned in, observing the precision and care with which she addressed every possible angle, the thoroughness of her logic leaving little room for misinterpretation or challenge. Emma allowed a brief pause between key points, letting the significance of her reasoning settle in the minds of the board members, her calm demeanor and controlled pacing creating a rhythm that drew the entire room into attentive focus. Ms. Blake's fingers tapped lightly against the leather table, a subtle sign of her internal acknowledgement of Emma's proficiency, while Mr. Johnson's eyes flicked over the data with a measured caution, recognizing for the first time the depth of preparation and insight that had gone unnoticed. Emma's voice carried softly yet clearly, each sentence constructed to lead logically to the next, connecting strategic recommendations to tangible outcomes in a manner that left no gaps, no uncertainty, and no room for dismissive reactions. The polished boardroom floor reflected the light and the concentration in the space, the faint aroma of coffee mingling with the intangible weight of recognition as the partners silently absorbed the breadth and clarity of her expertise. Every motion, every carefully placed emphasis, and every calm articulation of complex concepts contributed to a crescendo of understanding, shifting the perception of authority within the room, transforming initial assumptions into a clear acknowledgement of competence and intellect. The quiet authority Emma projected, paired with the meticulous structure of her reasoning, had effectively reframed the room, leaving the partners with no choice but to recognize that the woman they had underestimated had skillfully and confidently asserted mastery over the discussion, her presence commanding respect through logic, clarity, and the deliberate application of her knowledge, culminating in a moment of shared awareness that expertise and preparation had quietly but decisively reshaped the dynamic of the boardroom. Emma Carter set down the last document with a quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the boardroom one final time as the implications of her analysis settled in the air. The polished mahogany table reflected the late morning sunlight, casting long, angular shadows across the faces of Mr. Johnson and Ms. Blake, who sat motionless, pens paused mid-air, the carefully maintained composure giving way to subtle acknowledgement of the depth and clarity of her presentation. Emma's soft, deliberate voice carried across the room as she summarized key points, connecting each recommendation to measurable outcomes and practical strategies, her tone calm but compelling, commanding attention not through volume but through the precision and authority of her reasoning. The junior associates, who had watched with quiet curiosity, now leaned forward, absorbing each linkage and seeing how her insight tied every element together, the logical thread impossible to ignore. Mr. Johnson's eyes shifted slightly, a faint tightening around the corners suggesting the realization that the assumptions he had brought into the meeting were incomplete, that the quiet woman at the side of the room had orchestrated a thorough and meticulous examination that exposed gaps no one else had considered. Ms. Blake adjusted her posture, a subtle gesture betraying the recognition that Emma's insight had recalibrated the discussion entirely, the silent authority she projected now permeating the room with a presence that demanded respect. Emma gestured toward the supporting charts and figures with deliberate care, highlighting outcomes and potential solutions with a precision that emphasized clarity and competence, each movement reinforcing the validity of her conclusions while maintaining an unassuming demeanor that contrasted sharply with the partner's earlier attempts at dominance. The air in the room, faintly scented with coffee and polished wood, seemed to thicken with focused attention, the subtle hum of the ventilation blending into the concentrated silence that accompanied the culmination of her presentation. Each partner absorbed the careful structure and thoroughness of her reasoning, the quiet but undeniable command of the material forcing an internal acknowledgement of skill that could not be dismissed. Emma's hands moved with controlled grace, pointing to critical clauses, numerical summaries, and strategic notes, ensuring that the logic was transparent, the connections evident, and the consequences clear, guiding the boardroom toward understanding without confrontation or showmanship. The sunlight glinted off the polished floor, reflecting the intensity of focus and subtle shifts in the partners' expressions as the realization of competence sank in, transforming the room from one of hierarchical posturing into a space defined by recognition of intellect and preparation. The quiet energy that Emma had cultivated throughout the meeting now held sway, a tangible acknowledgement that authority was not determined by position alone, but by preparation, clarity, and the skillful application of knowledge. As the final words left her lips, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension lifting slightly, replaced by a respect earned silently yet undeniably, leaving Mr. Johnson and Ms. Blake to absorb the full measure of Emma Carter's insight and the subtle but complete transformation of the boardroom dynamic. The meeting room remained silent for a few heartbeats after Emma Carter concluded her detailed presentation, the polished surface of the mahogany table reflecting the soft, mid-morning sunlight that had shifted slightly through the expansive windows. Mr. Johnson leaned back in his chair, his usually commanding posture subtly softened, eyes narrowing as he processed the depth and precision of her arguments, the meticulous attention to detail and the strategic foresight she had demonstrated leaving little room for dispute. Ms. Blake's hand lingered over her notes, a slight tension in her fingers giving away the realization that the quiet woman they had underestimated had just reshaped the dynamics of the entire discussion with her clarity, composure, and competence. The junior associates and staff present exchanged quiet, astonished glances, recognizing that they had witnessed a display of methodical skill and confident reasoning that transcended the usual bounds of expectation within the boardroom. Emma herself remained composed, her posture relaxed yet commanding, eyes scanning the room to acknowledge the subtle signs of acknowledgement and newfound respect that had replaced the earlier expressions of doubt and dismissiveness. She allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the insights she had shared settle fully across the table, the room absorbing the transformation from one of hierarchical authority and assumed dominance to a space defined by recognition of true expertise. Mr. Johnson finally exhaled, a quiet, measured sound that broke the tension, and nodded slightly, the hint of a smile suggesting a begrudging respect as he considered the thoroughness of her preparation and the irrefutable logic that had guided her every statement. Ms. Blake mirrored the gesture, her own acknowledgement subtle but unmistakable, the previous air of superiority now replaced with a clear understanding that Emma's competence had earned its place at the table. The polished floor, reflecting the sunlight and the figures of those seated, seemed to carry the collective sense of realization, a quiet resonance that emphasized how a single, calm, and prepared individual could command attention and respect without overt displays of power. Emma's hands rested lightly on the folder in front of her, the precise, methodical manner in which she had conducted her analysis leaving an impression that extended beyond the content itself, communicating patience, insight, and unwavering confidence. The boardroom, once a stage for gestures of assumed authority, now hummed with an invisible recognition of skill and intellect, The partners' earlier attempts at condescension fully reversed as they silently acknowledged the clarity, competence, and quiet mastery that Emma had brought to every aspect of the discussion. The sunlight highlighted the subtle changes in the expressions and posture of the room's occupants, casting shadows that seemed to echo the shift in energy from skepticism and dismissal to contemplation and respect. Every detail Emma had orchestrated, every careful point in annotation, had contributed to a cumulative understanding that transformed the meeting, leaving the partners and attendees alike with a lasting impression of the power of preparation, intelligence, and composed authority. As the silence lingered, the room seemed to settle into a new rhythm, one dictated not by title or status, but by the undeniable command of expertise and the quiet, steadfast presence of Emma Carter, ensuring that the final moments of the meeting were marked not by noise or argument, but by an unspoken acknowledgement of skill and the respect it naturally earned.